Hola, muchachos y muchachas. Just kidding, that's all I know, but I love it. This is part 2 of the brake pads and rotor replacement on a 07 Yukon. This will be the same for many makes and models such as the Cadillac Escalade, Chevy Avalanche, Chevy Silverado, Chevy Suburban, Chevy Tahoe, GMC Sierra, GMC Yukon, and the Yukon XL. In this video, I'm going to tell you what tools we are using, show you what parts that you're going to need, and give you the brake specifications on torque specs. So you might be wondering, how do I get the torque specs? Let me show you. Ha! This here, the Motor Guidebook for Brake Specification. This is a very helpful book. Lets me know the torque specifications on most vehicles. I've got a few of these books. They're bigger yellow books and the brake books. I love Motor Guide books, and I believe Matco bought them, so it says Matco on these now. So those will be also in the description below if you need one of these books. If you're working on a vehicle that is similar to what I am showing you in this video and you think the brake specifications might be a little bit different, make sure you comment below and I will let you know the actual brake specs or torque specs on that vehicle as well. If this video does help you out, comment below with the year, make, model of the vehicle that it did help you on. Like, subscribe, and share while you're watching. Look for helpful links below. Let's get going. Now we're back in the garage. In this video, in part 2, we're going to reassemble everything. If you missed part 1, check the video library or maybe a link in the description below to find part 1. That'll be the complete disassembly. So here in part 2, reassembly, going to show you all the tools we need. I'm going to show you the torque specifications when we tighten everything up and everything that you're going to need to do a proper BJ on these trucks. Super simple, super easy. First, we're going to remove the bolts that I use to press the rotor off of the hub. These are the bolts that are actually going into the slider pin through the caliper bracket. So if you're going to use these, just make sure you don't destroy them trying to press the rotor off of the hub assembly. Now, let's remove everything from the caliper bracket. First, we're going to remove the brake pads, set those off to the side. We're not going to use those again or reinstall them, obviously, but we will be using the old brake pads to press the piston back into the caliper shortly on in the video. After we remove the brake pads, we're going to take the hardware kit off. These are the silencers, the shims, whatever you want to call these. Set those off to the side. Again, we're not going to reuse those because we got a brake pad kit that includes everything, which you should as well. When you remove everything, sometimes, or a lot of times, I recommend taking a lot of pictures as you're doing this, just in case you forget where the brake pads or the position the brake pads are in. On this vehicle, the wear indicator was on the inboard pad, so make sure you install it in the same fashion it was removed. After that hardware kit is out, I'm using this here wire brush. I'm going to clean everything up. This is just to remove the brake dust, road grime, anything that has gotten under the shim kit. Just take it all off or wash it all off, clean it off so that it's nice and very easy to put everything back together. You don't have any extra gunk under it that's going to hamper the pad movement. Remove the slider pins. This one was really gunked up, so the slider pins were pretty much seized in this one. They slid a little bit, but not as easy as they should. I'm using some brake clean right here. I'm going to spray it inside the slider pin holes, and then I'm going to slide the slider pins in and out a few times to do a couple things. Try to scrub a little bit of the inside of the slider pin bore, and also get the slider pins cleaned up with that brake clean too. So you can see just jamming it in and out, just getting everything so that it'll slide very easily. While the brake clean is marinating inside the caliper, go ahead and wipe off the slider pins. Clean off the slider pins really well. Shouldn't have any gunk built up on these. If there is any gunk built up, go ahead and use that wire brush and clean it off and just wipe it off. Make sure you have a nice shiny surface on the whole thing. You don't want any of the old stuff built up on there when we reinstall the slider pins into the caliper in a little bit. If you look in the video library and find the front brake process, you can see it took me a while to clean those slider pins off. The tweaker tool brush right there, slide it in and out of the caliper bracket. Try to get everything that's inside there off the walls. Go around in a circle. Do anything you can to try to get that cleaned out the best you can. After I do this, get it cleaned out with that wire brush, I'm going to use my air blower to blow everything out of the hole. And also, brake clean is acetone, so the air that I'm spraying in there right now will also dry up the acetone so it doesn't leave any residue or anything inside there that'll contaminate the brake grease when we reinstall everything. So make sure everything is all dry, cleaned up. Get ready to install a nice clean bracket This brake job process, the rear axle, should take about 1.5 to 2 hours to complete. It didn't take long. It took me about 45 minutes to make this video, so 1.5 hours with making a video really isn't that bad. So you should be able to take care of this at home within 2 hours, both sides. Before we install the new rotor, make sure we clean off the hub. I'm using a wire brush right here, but take everything off of there. If you feel any burrs or any high or low spots, brush that off. You want a nice, clean, smooth surface to mount the rotor to when you're reassembling everything. If you do not, it could cause a high or low spot and cause vibration in the brakes. You wonder what in the world is going on. It's just you didn't have a smooth surface right here on the hub when you installed that new rotor. Honestly, in the past, I haven't been doing this part of the process too much. I always forget this part for some reason. I never had that problem, but I've had a lot of people complain or add a comment in my videos or on my videos and let me know that this is one big step I'm missing, and they are right. So this is something that we all should do when we are doing a proper brake job. Again, double check your parking brake pad inside there. Like I said, this one looks good, so there was no need to adjust it or to replace it. For some reason, my sister, this is her truck, she doesn't use that parking brake at all, ever. So I think within the 150,000 miles that are on this vehicle, it's probably been used a couple times. Mentioning 150,000 miles, this is the first rear brake job on this truck. At 150,000 miles, these are the factory pads, so that's really not bad. On top of checking the parking brake pad out and making sure it's adjusted properly, also look inside there, make sure your axle seals are good. If you see anything wet inside the parking brake pad area and it's not from the little master cylinder inside there, or slave cylinder inside there I should say, you might want to look into the axle seal. But everything looks good on this, so we're going to reinstall everything. To get the bracket ready, we're going to lubricate the sliders. Lubricate them pretty liberally. I use a lot of grease. Sometimes people say I use too much. You want to have a nice, smooth, even application of grease on the sliders. When you do lube them up, stick them inside the slider holes and make sure it moves in and out. I do 10-15 times, just in and out, jam them in there. Make sure I don't feel anything getting bound up inside there so that I know that it's going to be moving in and out freely. The brake grease I'm using in this situation is some new ceramic brake grease. It seems to work really good. It's some high temp stuff. I'll try to add a link in the description below for this as well. But this ceramic stuff, it's purple, which is pretty cool too. I like purple. I haven't had any problems with it. The older brake grease I used, for some reason, over time when it got hot or whatnot, it seemed to gunk up a little bit. So I switched over to this stuff about a year ago, and I haven't had any problems with the lubrication or with brake calipers getting seized up really quick. Now that we have the brake caliper bracket ready to go, everything's greased up, it's all cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and install the rotor onto the hub. When I put the new rotor on, or when I put rotors on, I like to use a lug nut or two to hold the rotor in place while I am reassembling everything. That makes it so it doesn't move around when I'm installing the caliper and whatnot. It's a lot easier to assemble everything if you have something holding the rotor in place. So 1 or 2 lug nuts across from each other is fine. Makes it so much easier for you. With that rotor on, the next step will be pressing the piston back into the caliper. But before we do that, we need to open up the cap on the reservoir. So when we press the piston into the caliper, the fluid that goes back up into the reservoir has somewhere to escape to. You don't want to blow any seals or anything like that. Never had that problem, but that is a possibility. The fluid needs somewhere to escape to. When you do this, you might get some brake fluid on the ground up in the front of the truck, and don't worry about that because you're pushing everything back up into the reservoir. It might overflow up there. So if you have a pig pad or something, put that under the truck at this time and make it a lot easier for cleanup later. And you could use that brake clean around the reservoir after you put the cap back on to clean everything up too if you get any brake fluid coming out of the reservoir when we press this piston back in. Now the old brake pad that we took out of the caliper bracket a little bit ago, we set that off to the side. Grab that brake pad, one of them, both of them, either one, and a brake caliper compressor. The brake caliper compressor that I'm using in this video is a really cheap one. I think it was like 10 bucks, maybe 10 years ago. They're probably up to about 20 bucks now. But you will find a link in the description below for this tool as well. Back the compressor out all the way so it fits in the caliper between the pad and the caliper ears. And we're going to press that piston in as far as we can. While doing this process, you do not need to open up the brake bleeder or the brake system anywhere. This will push the fluid back into the reservoir. When you follow the steps I'm doing in my brake jobs, we do not need to bleed the brakes after you complete the BJ. If you were to open the brake bleeder at this time, you would need to make sure you bleed the air out. Even if you're pushing everything out, you would need to bleed the brakes after it. But if you follow my steps or my process, you do not need to bleed the brakes when you're done doing this BJ. Now that the piston is pressed completely back into the caliper, set it off to the side again. You don't want to let it hang from the brake line. Make sure it's fully supported somewhere, either on the frame of the vehicle or somewhere on the suspension. Just make sure it's not hanging from the brake line. Let's grab that brake caliper bracket that we cleaned up and set off to the side a moment ago. We're going to put that over the caliper onto the axle. Just snug the bolts up because we're going to use a torque wrench to finally tighten everything down. It is really important that you use a torque wrench when doing brakes. You don't want to over tighten anything and cause the brakes to not work properly. You don't want to under tighten anything to the point where your brakes are going to fall off while you're driving. That would suck too. Install both bolts through the caliper bracket into the axle. If you were to do a brake job like this at home, I would expect, or in this case, we spent about 320 bucks on all 4 brake pads and rotors. So the front axle and the rear axle with the hardware kit, everything came as a set from Power Stop. Very useful set. I love the Power Stop brakes. There are other good brakes out there, like Raybestos. There's another brand I like to use. But in this case, it was about 320 bucks for everything, which really isn't a bad deal. So if you were to take this to a shop, the front and rear brake pads, I would expect for the kit or the parts and the labor, you'd be spending somewhere around $500 to $700 to get this job done. So doing it at home, you're gonna save a lot of money. Might take you a few hours to get this job done, but you're gonna save yourself a ton of money. With the caliper bolts snugged up, we're gonna grab a 1/2-inch torque wrench. These 18mm bolts are gonna be snugged up to 148 foot-pounds. That's pretty tight on these things. According to the motor book, the brake specifications chart, 148 foot-pounds on the rear brake caliper bracket is the proper tightening specifications. When you tighten up using your torque wrench, go to that first click and you're done. I used to back off and make it click 2 or 3 times. So tighten it up, click, let off, tighten it up again, click, and I would call it good. But I had people comment as well and let me know, don't do that, because the second time you do it, that might be the time that the bolt actually breaks. Never had that problem either, but hey, that is something that you might want to take in consideration. I did learn from that, and I also just go to the first click or 1 click and I call it good and move on. You can see the angle or how I had to get inside the wheel well to tighten these bolts up on that brake caliper bracket. I had to shimmy inside there, bend over a little bit. That's one thing I don't miss about doing automotive work full time anymore, is I don't miss being a contortionist to tighten stuff up. So that's how I had to get inside there and get the proper torque specification or tighten these to the proper torque specification. Now that everything is tightened up, let's go ahead and install the new hardware kit, the shims or the silencers, whatever you want to call these. We're going to put them, it doesn't matter on the top or the bottom first, just get them inside the caliper bracket. Sometimes I will install these before I put the bracket on, and you could choose to do that as well. Hopefully you're watching this video before you're doing the brake job, and it's giving you a few options. You can see, just load them in there. They'll lock into place. Make sure they're nice and flush all the way up into the caliper bracket. If you did not clean the dust and grime off, you might not get these to set perfectly, which would cause these pads to not slide properly. I do not lube the ears of the pads, and only reason I do not lube the ears of the pads is because you might get brake dust or road grime built up on that grease and cause the pads to not apply evenly. So I do not add grease to the ears when there is a hardware kit like this. Also, when installing the brake pads, make sure you install the brake pads in the same fashion that you removed them. The inboard pad had the wear indicator. Just make sure it's put back in the same position that you removed it. Now we have both brake pads in the caliper bracket on the rotor. They're nice and flush on that rotor. Grab the caliper itself and install it over the pads. Be careful to not hit the silencers or the shims on the back sides of the pads with the caliper itself and knock those off. If you do knock those off, you might end up getting some squeaking, squealing, grinding sounds, something like that, right after you reinstall everything. So make sure everything goes on easily and evenly. If there's any problems, take it back off, double check everything. You might not push the piston all the way into the caliper. Just make sure everything goes together easily. Snug up the caliper bolts into the sliders. Here I'm using the crescent wrench to hold the slider so it doesn't spin while I'm tightening everything up. And I'm just going to snug it up again because we're going to use a 3/8 torque wrench to tighten these caliper bolts up to 28 foot-pounds. So 28 foot-pounds on these 13mm bolts. If on your vehicle it's a different size bolt on the caliper or the bracket, let me know. Comment below. Let other people know as well. So if they're getting ready to do their BJ, they'll get everything together, have all the right tools and parts before they get started. Now that those caliper bolts are snugged up, 3/8 torque wrench, 28 foot-pounds, go to the first click and you are good. After you get this caliper tightened up, torqued down to the proper torque specifications, you're pretty much done with the reassembly process. But don't forget about the reservoir up under the hood, and after you tighten up the cap on the reservoir, you should press on the brake pedal maybe 3 to 5 times. Just get the brake pedal to firm up nice and firm, so that'll reapply the brake pads, push the fluid that is needed in the calipers back into the calipers. And after you do that, double check the fluid reservoir again. If the fluid reservoir has gone down a little bit and you need to top off the brake fluid, top that off before you get on your way. And that is it. Your BJ is done. You can see, I've been told a lot. I do some of my best work on my knees, and not something I like to do too much anymore, but hey, I must say, I do some of my best work on my knees. These brake jobs, one of my favorite things to do, brake jobs on any vehicle that is, and hopefully this video helped you do your BJ on your vehicle. If it did, comment below your make, model, let me know. Let everybody know that this video helped you as well. Make sure you check out the video library before you go too far. There's a ton of helpful videos on this vehicle in my library. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. I'll see you on the next hopefully helpful video.